Wow, this is back to reality, folks. That was just a little taste of heaven yesterday afternoon. We had 200 people singing together yesterday for a couple of hours, and that was just, I went home kind of light on my feet, I guess is the way I'd put it. I'm not sure I have them on the ground yet, so I'm not sure what's going to happen this morning in class. But we're going to try to get through Matthew chapter 19 and continue in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We finished in last week, the end of 18, Jesus's time in Galilee. It's over. He is now turning to make his way toward Jerusalem. Matthew doesn't quite describe it that way, but that's the way it's phrased in some of the other Gospels. And so picture in your mind's eye, if you will, a long walk with Jesus, because these disciples are walking from Galilee to Jerusalem, or to Judea, I would say first, and ultimately Jerusalem, where he will be crucified. We have seen him go from the mountaintop of Mount Hermon and the Transfiguration a couple of chapters ago to where we are now. And as they walk, you can imagine these conversations that the Lord is having with these disciples and these men. And he is imputing to them heavy topics as they walk. And he is giving them the building blocks, because these will be the future foundation for the church and the kingdom of heaven on earth. He is giving them the building blocks in these doctrines and in these teachings of what the kingdom is to be like and what they are to teach those who will join them in this spiritual building, the church. And there's going to be conflict between what we read here in the next several chapters and what they are familiar with within the Mosaic law. And chapter 19 is rife with that, specifically concerning this issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Matthew 19 is not hard to understand. It's hard to apply and accept, I guess, would be what I would say. Okay. But we're going to try to get through it. Now, I've already told Jeff and Leah, who are here visiting with us again this morning, they've been here with us before, brother and sister-in-law, Joni's sister. I told them, I don't want any hard questions about Matthew 19 and marriage and divorce. Okay. I didn't write a commentary on it. I haven't ever preached huge lessons on it. I haven't published a book about it, but plenty of fellows have. But it is not the easiest chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. I was trying to get Will to take over when he got here because I knew Matthew 19 was coming, but so is Matthew 25 and 26. So those are going to be some other highlights to maybe make sure you're here for, and maybe we'll have a guest lecture for those chapters. We'll get Will up here to take over. So he's wise beyond his years. He opted to sit back and say, no, I think it's good for you to finish the book. I was like, okay, well, here we go. In our outline for Matthew, chapter 19 begins with this phrase, and we've seen this several times before. Matthew, one way to break the book down is these books of transitions, where Matthew uses this phrase or something very similar to this. It's just a kind of a marker in the narrative. When Jesus had finished these words, okay, when there's a phrase like that, it occurs like 9 times in the Gospel of Matthew. And it separates, kind of a curtain drops and a new curtain rises. If you were watching a play, you know how you go from one scene to the next. Sometimes the curtains close and then reopen and you see a new scene. Well, that's kind of what Matthew's doing with this phrase. And so he leaves them from Galilee, curtains close. When Jesus has finished these things, verse 1, he departed from Galilee and came into the region, and this is interesting, the region of Judea, beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So he continues to heal, perform miracles, And now we're in this area of Judea beyond Jordan. In your mind's eye, as you look at the geography of Palestine at this time, do you really ever consider that Judea was also east of the Jordan River? Or do you always think of the Jordan River as the dividing line? That's the way I typically think of it. But they actually have a phrase here that they use to describe this area of Judea beyond the Jordan. Okay, and some commentators I've read about this indicate that the area they're really describing is later described in other places as Perea. Okay, this area that's east of Samaria, but on the east side of the Jordan. He hasn't gotten truly down to what we think oftentimes of southern Palestine or southern Canaan, the land of Judea per se. This area beyond there, it's a government issue the way it's described and how it's described, but it will be important, I think, with what is entertained here in Matthew 19. It's going to come into play. And so I'd like to read the first 15 verses and get this in our head concerning this issue of marriage and divorce. Who would like to read the first 15 verses for us? Sandra, jump in. Thank you.
Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, is it better not to marry?" But he said to them, "All cannot accept the saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." Then little children were brought to him. Wait, keep going?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then little children were brought to him that he might put his hands on them and pray. But the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And he laid his hands on them and departed from there.
All right. Okay, well, let's move on to verse 16. There's a lot in those chapters that are in these verses, isn't there? I know it piques my interest to poke at it a bit, and I think it will is you. So let's kind of see if we can distill some of what Jesus is doing here. First of all, this idea of Judea beyond the Jordan, which I think is in the area of Perea. Now, why does that come into play? Well, the Pharisees are asking this question of Judah concerning marriage and divorce, aren't they? If you look closely at it, verse 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus. It's not the disciples that are asking this question. That's the first key we need to remember in the context of what we're going to read in 19. Who is the audience in Jesus here? There is a question that's been asked. There's been a taunt thrown out, and Jesus is responding to that. Okay? Now, why do the Pharisees take this opportunity to ask this question? It says in order to test him or trick him. Why do they take this opportunity to make this stumbling block for Jesus? They think for Jesus. Go back in your mind a few chapters in the book of Matthew. Who recently was beheaded? John the Baptist. Why was John the Baptist beheaded? It centered around the issue of what? Or who? An unlawful marriage of who? Herod to who? Herodias, who was who? His brother's wife. What do we have here? And it says that Herodias had done what with Philip, her husband? She had what? Very unusual. She had divorced him, which is also counter to the Mosaic law, because women couldn't do that in the Mosaic law. It was the man. It was the husband who could divorce the wife. You ever think of that? That's it. Nowhere in Scripture in the Old Testament does it say that the wife could ever divorce the husband. It was always the husband divorced the wife. Okay, that issue becomes very important in understanding what's said in Matthew 19 also, and we'll get to that. The beheading of John. Where did that happen? Newsflash. Herod had 3 fortress palaces. Herod Antipas, the Herod that cut off John the Baptist's head. One of those fortresses, and many think the fortress where John was kept, was across the Jordan, away from the followers of John, more and most remote. So his influence would be removed from among the people, and that's where Herod Antipas kept John imprisoned. And that's where he was beheaded, in Perea. That land was under the authority of Herod Antipas. Okay? He was given that area by the Romans. That was part of his rule. Now, he was also over the land of Galilee, wasn't he? But he also had under his control Perea, or Judea beyond the Jordan. That's how that land was divided among Herod, the boys of Herod the Great. Herod Antipas had that. And so now the Pharisees have Jesus perhaps very close, where John the Baptist has lost his head over the teaching about marriage and divorce. They've taken what a coincidental time to ask this question of Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Now, were they sincere in asking this? Obviously not. It says that they sought to test him or trick him. So they don't care about the answer. What do they want to achieve by asking Jesus this question now? They want what happened to John the Baptist to happen to Jesus. If John the Baptist can lose his head from Herodias about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, maybe Herodias will stick her greedy, grubby hands into this situation and take care of Jesus for us. Something to think about. Let's look on. 3 times the Pharisees have asked or will ask Jesus this question with the preface statement, is it lawful? And this is the second time that Matthew records these 3 events. Is it lawful? The first one was about healing on the Sabbath day in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10. Is it lawful? They don't care about the answer. They're just poking at an issue that they think will separate Jesus from the multitudes. Or he's in violation of the Sabbath day, is the point. Now we see this issue about divorce. They take this opportunity to try to separate Jesus and his teaching from those of the believing multitudes on this issue of marriage and divorce. And it just so happens that it happens almost on the doorstep of the fortress, perhaps where John the Baptist was slain. The last time that this happens is in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 17. They're going to come to Jesus and ask him this question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And where does that happen? Where is he in Matthew chapter 22? He's in the capital city, Jerusalem, prior to the week of his death. This is right, I think, right before he tosses over the money changing tables and all of that for the last time. He is in the midst of the capital city, and lo and behold, they ask him a question about taxes. So now they're trying to separate him and shine an ugly light on Jesus and his teachings, not so much with the multitudes, but also to include the Romans, with how he will answer, do we just push off Caesar, or how do we deal with this? Is it lawful? They have no sincerity in any of these three times with the answer Jesus provides. They're seeking a way to get him condemned by either the multitudes or by Herod or by the Romans. They're trying every major group they can to drive a wedge between Jesus and those three groups with these three instances. Pretty smart, isn't it? Pretty deceitful, isn't it? Does it kind of show you the plan of Satan and the length of time Satan was working throughout the ministry of Jesus? I mean, Satan's not just running around all tactical on this, chasing fires that Jesus is planting. He's strategic in this. And we see his plan with these various groups just laid out for us as we have it revealed as we read it. And so the motive, they're not sincere, and they sought to tempt Jesus with this. And so that's the setting. And the whole point in Matthew 19 about marriage and divorce is the interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. That's the rub. And the Jews aren't even settled on this. Okay, depends on the school of rabbinical thought or teaching as to what the Jews believed about this question. For instance, the school of Shammai taught that the unseemly thing, that's a quote from Deuteronomy 24, is describing sexual misconduct in marriage. Okay? We would use the term fornication or sexual immorality for that. The Greek word is porneia or pornea. Okay? The school of Shammai said that's the unseemly thing. That is a valid reason for divorce. The school of Hillel said that the unseemly thing in her, again, 24, verse 1, the unseemly thing in the wife could be anything minor that did not please the husband, and it's okay to divorce. Okay? These are major schools of thought among the Jews. Okay? These aren't just fringe teachers among the Jews. They have great influence. The last one, Akiva, he taught in his line of thinking as a rabbi that no favor in his eyes, which is also out of Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1, this unseemly thing and having no favor in the husband's eyes meant even if he simply became attracted to other women. In other words, well, my wife was pretty, but now that she's middle-aged and got some wrinkles, I got this new girl that's moved in around the corner, and man, she's kind of nice. She's pretty. I like her more. Akiva would say, well, then just divorce your first wife and marry another. You're okay. Because you're no longer pleased with your first wife. You would be more pleased with the second one. And, it's marriage until not death do you part, but until you're just not interested anymore. And you can move on. Now, again, that's for the husband. Those were the lines of thought. What happens to the women or the wives that are receiving the consequences of these three thoughts? They've got nothing. They're cast out. They're disparaged. They're gossiped about. They're given, people start saying, oh, well, she must be a prostitute, or she must be behaving ill toward her husband. And so therefore, he's legitimized and she's made to be a guilty party, whether she's guilty of anything or not. That is why Moses says and does what he does, as quoted and talked about here in Matthew 19. Because of the hardness of their heart, Moses actually instills things. When you don't do God's will, there's consequences. But I'm going to protect the innocent who have no other means of protection. You've got to give this woman a bill of divorcement. You've got to state the reason why. You know, he's putting things in place to protect women that never would have been in place had he not said these things. He's not approving divorce. He's saying, if you're so obstinate and arrogant and hard toward your spouse that you do these things, you have to do these things also to protect her. The ultimate, that's not fair, comes into play. Because in that situation, in that time especially, what would women have? Could they be a witness in a crime, in an investigation of a crime? No. Women could not be witnesses in a court of law. Could they own property in many cases? No. Except, save in some inheritance situations. Okay? And so, all of this that we read from Jesus's perspective, again, is pointing to answering the questions from the wicked Pharisees' questions who are seeking to trap or tempt the Lord. Okay? So here's two possible reasons why this even comes up. Number one is they're just seeking to embroil Jesus in this rabbinical debate. This is a hot topic for the Jews in general. And so if I can get 2/3 of the people to believe, to think and get upset with what Jesus is teaching, that's pretty successful from their point of view. And they're seeking to see, well, where are you going to come down on this, Jesus? You say you're the Son of God and all of those things. So what do you say about this complicated issue that's always a generator of angst whenever it comes up among the Jewish people? Or they're seeking to take advantage of where this happens with the idea of Herod Antipas and the beheading of John. I think it's this latter ultimately, because it has a grander goal in mind. They get rid of the Jesus problem. Okay. But it could have been both. But I tend to think this second one, for me, carries a lot of weight. Okay. Thoughts or questions up to this point? I don't want to lose anybody because we're getting ready to dive into a little bit more of what the text actually says. Go ahead, Larry.
Just a small footnote. It's interesting in Jesus' teaching in Mark 10:12, he does recognize the potential of a wife putting away her husband. And so says, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So interesting footnote for further study.
Again, that doesn't say that's what the Mosaic law taught.
No,
it says what Jesus says.
That's right.
From the very beginning, it was not so. Okay. The Lord through Moses didn't want to provide the auspices or the responsibilities for the woman who's put away, in the sense that was contrary to the law from the very beginning, right? So you understand that's a nuance, but it doesn't change what Matthew has said here, okay? And so the common view among the Jews at this point, because of these various rabbinical thoughts, the common view was, you can divorce your wife for every cause. Wow, that's kind of like today, isn't it? Why, how and why can you get divorced today? You don't even have to have a reason. In fact, in the 1970s, I forget the year and which state it was, I think 1974 was the first time that any state in the United States accepted no cause divorce. In other words, we just don't get along anymore. We're not interested in being married anymore, and you can't hold us to something neither one of us want. And so no cause divorce became accepted. And it's more and more widespread to the point I think just about every state is like that now. You don't have to put any reason down. Okay. In fact, it allows the politics and the court system to avoid the issue of, well, who's guilty and who's innocent? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Well, that's great for politicians because they don't have to answer to any moral standard at all, do they? And they don't even have to reflect an answer. That's kind of where the Jews were by and large with this. They don't even want to touch this subject. And so this kind of explains why the disciples say what they say about how hard it is. Well, if that's the case, Lord, it's better not even to get married. We're going to get to that. So, in essence, in this time, because of the common view, they basically have loosed where God has bound. And that's the situation. So while they're asking this question of Jesus to trap him and trick him, it gives Jesus the opportunity to teach the truth in this profoundly important area that will certainly affect the kingdom of heaven. Does the kingdom of heaven get affected by families and marriage, divorce, and remarriage today? Does it affect anybody here? If you've been affected by divorce and marriage in your family or in your lifetime, raise your hand. Have you ever had to look at Matthew 19 and then try to apply it to a family situation? It is everywhere, brethren, and it is getting more prevalent every day because our society is shoving away what Jesus has plainly taught in Matthew 19. We just want to do it for whatever reason because I said I could. I told myself I could. And that's kind of where it boils down to. Marriage is not, and this is a quote, marriage is not some sort of an evolving paradigm. Supreme Court of Massachusetts, 2004. That was part of a ruling of theirs. This centered around same-sex marriage, by the way, in 2004. Remember George Bush, right? And the law we passed that lasted less than a year until it got to the Supreme Court about marriages between a man and a woman. That lasted about 9 or 10 months. This was in that time frame. And marriage is not an evolving paradigm like the Supreme Court of Massachusetts said. So in other words, what are they saying here? What the Bible says about marriage, what? It was fine for them then. But it's this evolving paradigm. We're more enlightened now. So therefore, if two homosexuals want to get married, they deserve the same rights and privileges of a heterosexual marriage of a man and a woman. And what does Jesus say about that? From the beginning, it was not so. But they don't care. This is an important passage, folks. So marriage is why. We have to get back to why is this an important issue for the kingdom of heaven? Marriage is why, and this is in our text, we've read it. Marriage is why you leave your previous home, isn't it? For this cause, a man will do what? Leave his father and mother. Leave your previous home. Now, what's not said there is because why? Because you're establishing a new one. It's also why you cleave to one another to start this new home. And there's in verses 5 and 6, there's a term here we need to consider. In verse 5, this idea of being glued together. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The word there means glued. Okay, it means glued. The New American Standard uses the term joined. Actually, that's not really the best understanding. The idea is to be glued together. Now, in the next verse, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. That's where the idea of joining comes together. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Okay, there's a nuance between those two verses of the glued and then the joining. So, who does the gluing? No. The husband and the wife do the gluing. Who does the joining? God. Okay? You see the nuance Jesus is making with that? When a man and a woman decide to get married, they make a covenant with one another and they cleave to one another. They glue themselves together with intent. And then God, as witness to that covenant, determines, the understood thing is that they're eligible to be married. He then joins them together. And then Jesus makes the statement, what God joins together, don't you dare try to interject some school of rabbinical thought that tears apart what God has joined together. You can undo your glue all day long, but you can't undo the joinery of God. In summary, that's what God is saying here. Now, what kind of a marriage do you want? I want one that's double glued, double joined. I want one that's glued together, and I want one that's joined together. And when man gets in trouble, it's when they try to get rid of their glue, and then they wind up breaking the joints in order to get them apart. Y'all, I'm describing some furniture aspect. Y'all ever make furniture? Maybe in high school shop class where you had to cut the dovetails of your drawers. You glue those together. Let me tell you, the only way to tear apart an old, really well-made drawer of furniture is to break the dove joints. You can't salvage that wood. It's put together and there is no way to bring it apart without tearing stuff up. What do you think happens in marriage with divorce when you try to start doing that? What happens to the wood? What happens to the husband and the wife? What happens to the children? What happens to the family? There are splinters and weakness that's injected into that situation. That is exactly what happens when you just tear furniture apart. There's no putting it back together again. Sociologists will tell you that divorce affects anywhere from 3 to 5 generations after a single divorce. Now, who's a child of divorce? My wife is. Have you got any impact of that in your life? Have you seen how that's affected you? Leah, you're right there with her. How was that growing up? Rough, traumatic. I don't mean to put you on the spot. It was tough. I've seen it as the son-in-law from a distance. Okay? It's hard. There are consequences of that. Long-term consequences. Now, here's the heartbreakingest question. Can you see aspects of how that's affected your children? That divorce? Yeah, grandma's divorced. Has that affected our children any? I know it has. Hard questions at the dinner table. Hard questions in the car as you drive back and forth. How come grandpa's got another girlfriend? What do I call her? Got to come up with some creative name for a 3-year-old to call some woman that's living with your father. And I got sick and tired of trying to come up with all the names for all the different women we went through. You know, nanny 1, nanny 2, nanny 3. I mean, what do you call them? Other Nana? I had another Nana in my family. I'm not making that up. I mean, it happens. And I'm the third generation removed. This is serious, folks. It affects people's spiritual conditions because if I like my father and if I like my mother or my grandparents, I'm going to try to legitimize what they've done in some way. I'm going to want to tend to do that. And what's that called? Compromise. I know I'm preaching. But the other reason why marriage is important here is because the two become one flesh. And it says this here. So this is the reason why marriage is good. Oh, there we go. This is God's point, this joining together. If you look over in Malachi chapter 2, the Old Testament passage that talks the most about marriage, Malachi is where you go. Malachi chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 make this point about the difference of this gluing and joining. Malachi 2, 14 and 15 says that the man and woman make a covenant. God acts as witness, and when two have the right to marry, God makes them one. This goes far beyond, folks, the sexual relationship and the act of sexual union. We understand that could be a part of this, and it's easy to make that understanding. That is not what Jesus really has at the core of what he's teaching here. But he makes them one in his eyes. It's a covenant. God's part of it. But literally, this covenant means that God is the one that has yoked the husband and the wife together. Now, what's a yoke? As we use it here. What's a yoke?
A little contraption to hold two ox together.
Yeah, it's a big piece of wood that hooked two ox together so that they would have to work in unison to pull a plow or to pull a cart or a wagon, and they pull together. So you force multiply, don't you? It becomes not 1 horsepower, but a 2 horsepower wagon. Right? That's the point. Now, years ago, I worked in a summer camp a couple of years, and it was a Western camp. We had about 40 horses, but we also had a bunch of mules. And we taught the kids how to drive wagons. And even if they were really good and they came several years, we got them up to where they could drive a team of 6 mules pulling a stagecoach. It was really neat to watch an 8-year-old kid drive 6 horses down the road, or mules. But we had, among those mules, we had one mule, and his name was, it was number 8, was his name, but they all called him Ocho. Spanish for 8. Ocho and Dixie were the same size. They were a mated pair. Ocho loved to cheat and make Dixie pull all the load. And so what did we have to do to Ocho? We had to put what we called a cheater chain on him. What that did was it took that yoke and made his side shorter than her side. So it forced him to pull evenly, right? And so I would say that Dixie and Ocho did not have a good marriage because they were not equally yoked. Because every time we go down a road, Ocho would want to ease off and make her do all the work. Now, that's a simple illustration, but boy, there are profound lessons in that, right? But God yokes them together, and he yokes them together as one. Not 2 with a cheater chain, but one. What God has joined together in unions, when you have God joined unions, that Jesus commands then, let not man put asunder. Again, in that story, we had the same set of mules that always got joined together. We didn't just like, well, the first one out of the barn is up next to the wheel, and then the next one's, gets to the other side, and tomorrow it might be totally different. We put them up front as the lead wagon, the lead mules. No, because they were mated together in the sense that they were used to working together. They worked as a team, and you kept the team together. You can't separate them and just move them around willy-nilly. They don't work that way. What does God say about man and wife here? Husband and wife. Get used to working together. It's a lifelong job. We need to be together. And God does that. Verse 7 makes it sound like, as you listen to the Pharisees with this, verse 7 makes it sound like Moses had commanded them to put their wives away. Remember? If you remember what Sandra read? Why then did Moses say? Well, does that mean that Moses is commanding them to separate themselves and divorce their wives? At first read, it sounds like, oh, Moses told us to. Moses did not tell them to divorce. But it kind of reads that way. Well, that's convenient if you're trying to defend the concept of divorce for any reason. No. Moses never commanded them to put their wives away, and Jesus makes that point. This says a lot about their mindset, doesn't it? They're trying to find a way to get out of the God-joined union without tearing everything up. Well, Moses said we could. Well, that's going to stand in the day of judgment, isn't it? Hey, Lord, your inspired spokesman and prophet said we could do that. You think the Lord's going to accept that? Oh, yeah, I forgot he did. No, and Jesus doesn't accept it either. Moses provided them provisions under certain circumstances and offered certain protections for the woman, the wife. And there was valid reasons why that was needed. The divine command was what to do in the event that a woman was put away. That's what Jesus is speaking to here. Prevented a woman from being accused and subject to false accusations or abandonment without any recourse. There was no such thing as Social Security. There was no such thing as alimony. And those concepts that we have, they did not have. And so this was put in place as protection because of the, as Jesus describes, the hard-heartedness or hard-headedness of Israel. Do we have a just and loving God? Oh, yeah, we do. And boy, can we test those bounds sometimes. Israel sure tested it with this idea. So in verse 10, the law of Christ raised this divine expectation then regarding marriage and this marriage covenant to a higher level than the law of Moses did. And the disciples clearly see this. This is new for them. They had kind of gone along with the way that most of the Jews thought. What do they say concerning this? The disciples. Well, if that's the case, Lord, what? It's better not even to marry. And Jesus says, no, I didn't mean for you to take it to that length. Let me explain. Does he back up on this at all? He doesn't take one step back from what he has said to them. What he does is he hits that nail again with a hammer. He says, well, if that's the case, some men are made eunuchs by birth and some men are made eunuchs by men. If you can't abide by what I've taught, you shouldn't get married. And that's okay. Celibacy is not elevated to a higher level of spirituality in this conversation either, by the way. He's not saying it's more spiritual to not to marry, and only you carnal people who just can't keep your hands off each other have to get married, and the way to take care of that is through marriage. That's not the issue, but celibacy isn't elevated to this higher status for godly people. What he's addressing here, because he goes to this idea of a eunuch. What is a eunuch? Adult class. Someone who cannot fulfill the sexual act, in essence. Okay? And so if you're married and you aren't being satisfied in that area, or if you're married for that reason, perhaps you need to rethink how you stand and where you stand. Okay. He is saying, well, you need to be willing to discipline yourself and not pursue that one way or the other. You might need to make yourself a eunuch. Now, I don't think he means physically. He's talking about it in practice. If you divorce and you go through this and you've torn your marriage apart, you don't have a right to remarry for sexual fulfillment. You don't have a right to go get somebody else. You need to be as a eunuch. What does he say about giving up things in order to be a disciple of Christ? We've studied this already. We're going to see it some more. You got to be willing to give up father, mother, brother, sister, husband, wife. You have to be willing to give up things to be in the kingdom of heaven. It's no small coincidence that the very next couple of verses, when he finishes these, he puts the children back in the midst of this, among the midst of it. Except you become as one of these who are seeking my blessings, you're not going to be in the kingdom of heaven. Now, in this situation, this is the first time the children have been put into among the adults. He's just talked about the sexual relations, and then he brings in the small children and sets them into place. Do 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds have any issues with sexuality among themselves? They're pure, they're children, they have make-believe, they're children. They're wholesome. They're not with his sin one way or the other in this area. They haven't even gone there. And God says you may need to become as them in this topic of marriage. You have to be willing to give it all up, if necessary, to save your soul and be part of the kingdom of heaven. We're going to stop there because we ain't getting through the rest of this chapter. But there is a reason why in verse 16, we then move into this lesson concerning the rich young ruler. Because what's the question the first question the rich young ruler asked? What must I do to be saved? And it's connected, folks, to this issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The idea. What Jesus has just finished teaching about marriage bridges into this conversation of the rich young ruler. What must I be willing to give up in order to be in the kingdom of heaven? And what does God say to the guy who says, oh, I've done all these works. I've done every work and every command my entire life. And then what does Jesus say to him? Go and give your riches to the poor and you'll be fine. Oh my goodness, that's pretty hard, isn't it? And the young man went away sorrowful. Now we'll see all that next week as we look through it in detail. But ponder upon why Jesus gives that lesson immediately following this lesson about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. They're connected. They're connected. It's a hard thing what Jesus taught in Matthew 19 concerning being married. But it's one man, one woman for life, and it's a covenant with God, and he is your witness. And if you don't like that, then don't get married. And you can do that. Nobody's making you. But once you do that, you've put yourself in a different scenario of what you can undo. And what God has joined together, let not man put asunder, just because you like it. Or maybe don't like it anymore, depending on how you look at it. All right. I know I went a few minutes over. Comments or questions on that? If you have some, maybe we can talk about it next week because it is connected to the rich young ruler. Pete?
We'll wait the next week because it's going to be long.
Okay, keep that thought then. Thank you, Pete. Don't ask a hard question. Figure out how to make it a comment. I appreciate your attention this morning. Folks, this is an interesting chapter. It has a lot of interesting aspects to it, but it's meat of the word. And as Jesus walked on with his disciples, he was taking these opportunities to teach them the hard things because he's not going to be with them much longer to do that. Okay, thank you for your attention. We'll start in a few minutes down the road.